People often ask a dangerous question. Why do I keep going back to someone who hurts me? But the real question is deeper than that. Why does the pain feel impossible to leave behind, even when you know it is destroying you? Tonight, I want to talk not simply about toxic relationships, but about emotional addiction, the invisible, psychological loop that keeps two people tied together through conflict, suspicion, guilt, obsession, and emotional chaos. Because some relationships are not built on love. They are built on emotional dependency. And the most frightening part is this. Many people mistake emotional intensity for intimacy. The louder the conflict, the stronger they believe the connection must be. In modern psychology, this resembles trauma bonding. But ancient Eastern philosophy described this pattern centuries ago in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, not as a religious myth about death, but as a profound analysis of how human beings become trapped inside mental projections and repeat suffering endlessly. The text warns, human beings cling to suffering even when they recognize it as suffering. That single insight explains why some people fight, separate, reconnect, cry, accuse, forgive, and then repeat the same cycle again and again, because the relationship itself is no longer the center. The emotional loop is. Think about the structure carefully. Conflict, explosion, reconciliation, relief, then anxiety, then reconnection, then another explosion. Eventually, the brain begins to interpret emotional chaos as emotional meaning. Calm relationships start to feel empty. Healthy communication feels boring. Peace itself becomes uncomfortable. And this is where many people become trapped. One person becomes addicted to suspicion. The other becomes addicted to being understood. One becomes the accuser. The other becomes the misunderstood victim. But both are psychologically imprisoned by the same structure. Imagine a woman who constantly accuses her friend. You betrayed me. You're hiding something. You met my husband, didn't you? They scream at each other, block each other, swear never to speak again. But days later, one of them sends a message. We've known each other too long to end things like this. And suddenly the cycle restarts. Why? Because emotional conflict has become the glue holding the relationship together. The pain itself now produces emotional stimulation. And emotional stimulation creates attachment. This is why some people cannot leave relationships that are clearly destroying them. Not because they are weak, but because their nervous system has become conditioned to emotional volatility. The brain starts confusing suffering with aliveness. Psychologically, another dangerous phenomenon appears: reality distortion. Friends and family may say, there's no evidence. You're over-interpreting. You're projecting your fears. But the emotionally trapped person replies, you don't understand. I can feel it. And at that moment, emotion replaces evidence. Interpretation becomes more powerful than reality. A simple glance, a delayed text message, a change in tone becomes proof of betrayal. The person is no longer responding to reality. They are responding to their own internal fears projected outward. And eventually, something even stranger happens. The same person becomes both enemy and savior. I hate them, but they're the only one who understands me. This psychological contradiction is known as ambivalence. Simultaneous love and hatred directed toward the same person. But from a deeper philosophical perspective, both love and hatred may come from the same root: attachment. Hatred is often not the opposite of attachment. It is attachment in another form. This is why some people talk obsessively about the very person they claim to despise, because emotionally they are still bound to them. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Most people in these relationships believe the problem exists outside themselves. The toxic person is the problem. The manipulator is the problem. The narcissist is the problem. Sometimes those things are partially true, but the deeper structure survives because both people are psychologically participating in it. One needs control. The other needs validation. One fears abandonment. The other fears emotional emptiness. Both become trapped in roles. One becomes the victim. The other becomes the betrayer. And once identity forms around those roles, leaving the relationship feels like losing part of the self. That is why separation can produce withdrawal symptoms similar to addiction. Anxiety, emptiness, restlessness, obsessive thinking, the desperate urge to reconnect. At that point, people are no longer fighting for love. They are fighting to preserve a psychological identity. And this is why logic alone rarely solves these relationships. Friends try to intervene. They offer rational advice. Just cut them off. Move on. Stop talking to them. But emotional addiction cannot be solved by logic alone, because the attachment is no longer intellectual. It is neurological, emotional, and existential. This is exactly why the ancient warning from the Tibetan Book of the Dead remains relevant today. What you see is created by the mind. That statement does not mean reality is fake. It means human beings experience reality through interpretation, and interpretation can become a prison. The turning point only begins when someone asks a terrifying question. What if my interpretation is not absolute truth? That single moment changes everything. Not because it creates self-blame, but because it creates self-awareness. There is a profound difference between saying, "I am worthless," and saying, "My mind may be creating patterns that keep me trapped." The first destroys the self. The second awakens it. And perhaps this is the real reason people remain trapped in destructive relationships. They are not only afraid of losing the other person, they are afraid of losing the emotional identity built around the relationship itself. So the real escape is not merely cutting off a person. It is breaking the interpretation that keeps recreating the emotional loop. That is where freedom begins. And that is why some relationships do not end when contact ends. They only end when perception changes. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who may be trapped in this invisible cycle. And subscribe for the next part of this series, where we will explore why logical persuasion often makes these relationships worse, and how boundaries, distance, and psychological detachment actually work in the real world.